Good evening. Welcome to TheDustyFeet. It's October 13th, 2022. And as for Savannah, Georgia, it has been a beautiful day. So tonight, we'll be talking about the Feast of Sukkot. And yet, I suspect by the time we're finished, you might see something that you had not noticed before. And don't forget, in the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here in the Dusty Feet. Want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, learning we do here does not happen. So please be sure to click to subscribe, hit that bell icon for a reminder. Any other questions? Go to TheDustyFeet.com. And as always in the Dusty Feet, this is a place we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with more AlephBeta on the Dusty Feet. So here we are. We are smack dab in the middle of Sukkot. This beautiful Feast of Booths, this beautiful time of year to meet God and remember humble beginnings, protective beginnings, and a start of wonderful things. So let's enjoy the video from Rabbi David Fohrman and those wonderful folks at AlephBeta. This is not the entire video. The link, of course, is in the description below to the whole vid. But in this clip, will get us thinking, and I think we might have a few things to ponder on the other side. So, enjoy.
Hi there, this is Rabbi David Fohrman, and you are watching AlephBeta. Sukkot is right around the corner, and we all know how to celebrate it. Mainly, we build these little huts, and we live in them for 7 days. But why do we do that? What are we actually commemorating on this day? And here's where we kind of get into a bit of a quandary. To see that quandary, I'd like to play a little game with you. It's called Big Deal, Little Deal. Here's how the game works. We're going to take each of the 3 main festivals of the Torah, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, and we're going to ask ourselves, what event does this holiday commemorate? And is the event a big deal or a little deal? So let's play our game. We'll start with Pesach, Passover. What event does it commemorate? Well, that's easy enough. It celebrates our exodus from slavery, the night we left Egypt. All right, so what do you say? Would you call that event a big deal or a little deal? Well, I don't know about you, but I would say that's like the biggest of deals, right? On a scale from 1 to 10, Pesach's event is like a 10. There's plagues, blood, darkness, hail, fire. The sea splits in this climactic moment of triumph. Death to the bad guys, salvation to the good guys. It's a very big deal. Plus, it's our Independence Day, the very beginning of our nation. All right, what about Shavuos? How big a deal is the event commemorated by Shavuot? Well, on a scale from 1 to 10, it's like an 11, right? I mean, Shavuos celebrates the moment an entire nation rendezvoused with God. The Almighty literally descended into our world on the top of a mountain to give us a document that would define our destiny, that would shape the course of world civilization. Without that event, where would we be? What would we be? We'd be no more than a nomadic tribe in the wilderness. We'd be missing a mission. We'd be missing a legacy. That's a really big deal. All right, so let's go to Sukkot. So what does this holiday commemorate? Well, we sleep in booths, and we do that, the Torah tells us, L'man yedu dorotechem, so that your generations will know, Ki basukot hoshavti et bnei Israel, that I caused the children of Israel to dwell in booths, botziyotam meretz Mitzrayim, when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. All right, we sleep in booths, because we all slept in booths in the desert. So let's play big deal, little deal. On a scale from 1 to 10, everybody, how big a deal is that booth thing? I'm pretty sure it's like, I don't know, a 3.5. I mean, it's all very nice to sleep in booths. Certainly nothing against it, but do we have to have a whole holiday commemorating it? So you're probably shaking your head right now. Oh, come on, Rabbi Fohrman, the sukkahs, they aren't just about little huts. I seem to remember that the Talmud says something about miraculous clouds that protected the Israelites in the desert. And you know, that's actually true. The Talmud records a dispute as to what the holiday of Sukkot celebrates. One view is that it celebrates those booths that we slept in, but another Talmudic view is that the holiday commemorates what it calls Ananei HaKavod, clouds of glory that enveloped the people, protected them in the desert. So suppose we accept the second Talmudic view, that the holiday commemorates these miraculous clouds. Well, we certainly needed those clouds to survive. I mean, without divine protection of some sort, like those clouds, we would have perished in that uninhabited wilderness. We would have been killed by enemies or maybe wild animals. Isn't that worth celebrating? And, you know, to tell you the truth, you're right. But getting into that Talmudic explanation actually opens up some other problems. For example, does the Talmud really mean to tell us that we don't even know what we're celebrating on Sukkot, that it's actually subject to a dispute? I mean, think Passover, right? We know what we're celebrating. It's not like two views in the Talmud debate it. No one says Passover was really about celebrating God flying the Israelites out of Egypt on magic carpets or something. The facts of the Exodus, they aren't in dispute. How could something as basic as what we are celebrating on another holiday, on Sukkot, be open to dispute? So I'd like to suggest a theory here. Maybe there is a big deal in Sukkot, and it can be apprehended if we find its missing event. Here's what I mean by that. If you look at all the other holidays, you find that generally they commemorate a particular event, limited in time, that you could actually point to. I mean, Pesach, for example, it commemorates the night we went free. That's a particular event. Shavuot commemorates the moment we stood at Sinai and we received the Torah. But Sukkot, at face value, kind of breaks the pattern. It appears to commemorate 40 years worth of booth sleeping. Day in, day out, booths one night, booths the next. You know, is it really the case we have a holiday here that doesn't actually commemorate an actual event that you could point to, just like one thing, there it is? But maybe there is a discrete event with Sukkot too. And maybe if we can find it, we could see what the big deal in the holiday is all about. Let's return to that verse in the Torah, that verse that describes why it is that we celebrate Sukkot. Let's see what it tells us. The Torah says we celebrate Sukkot, L'man yedu dorotechem, so that generations will know, Ki basukot hoshavti et bnei Israel, that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths, behotziyotam meretz Mitzrayim, when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Now listen carefully to those words. When I brought them out of the land of Egypt. What exactly is the Torah saying right there? It sounds like the Torah was talking about a particular point in time, right? God made us sleep in booths when he brought us out of Egypt, not 40 years in the desert. That was way after he brought us out of Egypt. Seemingly, if we take the words of the verse really seriously, it was right when he brought us out that we slept in those booths. But wait a second, that sounds crazy. Is this whole booth commemoration thing really all going back to the very moment of the Exodus, like the first night? To find out, let's go back to the Torah's own description of those very first moments of leaving Egypt, way back in the book of Exodus. Is there anything there that involved Sukkot in some way? So listen to this verse. It describes the very beginning of Israel's journey away from Egypt. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael me Ramses Sukkota, and the children of Israel, they journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, k'sheshmot elef raglei agvarim levad mitaf, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. So read that verse again. Where did they travel to when they were leaving Ramses? They traveled to a place called Sukkot. Now, isn't that quite a coincidence? Sukkot just happens to be the name of the very first place that Israel encamped on their very first night after leaving Egypt. And you got to ask yourself, is that a coincidence? I mean, we have a Sukkot holiday that supposedly celebrates God causing us to dwell in Sukkot, quote, when he took us out of Egypt. And lo and behold, right when God took us out of Egypt, the Torah mentions we slept at a place called Sukkot. Could it be that the holiday commemorates where we slept that first night in the desert? In other words, to be perfectly frank with you, what I'm suggesting is actually something that kind of seems radical. When the Torah says that the holiday commemorates God having made us dwell in Sukkot, maybe the verse isn't actually referring to what we slept in. Maybe it's referring to a place we slept at, a place called Sukkot. But wait a second, you might say. What are you trying to tell me? That all those rabbis, the ones in the Talmud who talked about Sukkot celebrating sleeping in booths, the ones who talked about the clouds of glory, you're trying to tell me that they were all just wrong? That they missed this obvious implication of the verses? And anyway, Fohrman, let's just say you're right, that Basukot Hoshavti means that God settled us in the place called Sukkot. Why should we celebrate that? Who cares where we slept that first night we left Egypt? I mean, look, every place has got to have a name. This place, it happened to get called Sukkot. Great, time to feast. That's what we're celebrating? So here would be my response to that. The theory I'm suggesting to you, it doesn't actually oppose what the rabbis of the Talmud say. On the contrary, I'd argue, it's the basis for what they say. It's their point of departure. In other words, the rabbis of the Talmud, they too understood that the holiday commemorates our sleeping in a place called Sukkot. The rabbis were just making the following obvious inference. Why do you think the place got called that? Why, of all things, would you call a place Sukkot, basically the Hebrew equivalent of shantytown? It's probably because people made these little shanties, these little Sukkot huts to sleep in there. And here's the proof of the pudding. It turns out that here in Exodus is not the first time the Torah mentions to us a place by the name of Sukkot. Way back in Genesis, we encountered a place named that too. When Jacob left Laban's house, exiting his own personal slavery in his father-in-law's domain, one of the first places he came to was a place called Sukkot. And the Torah tells us why it was called that. Jacob built little huts there for his cattle, huts called Sukkot. And the Torah tells us that's why he called the name of the place Sukkot. So basically in Exodus, it seems like the Torah is just kind of using shorthand to get its point across. It's basing itself upon what it assumes we already know from the book of Genesis. In other words, the verse says, the Israelites, like Jacob before them, they also exited slavery. And like Jacob before them, they also had lots of cattle. And the very next thing we hear about is that like Jacob before them, the people slept in a place called Sukkot. So how did the place get its name? That's left implied. Obviously, it's because they built Sukkot there, little huts for their cattle, just like Jacob did in similar circumstances. The difference between the people and Jacob, if anything, is that while Jacob had built a house for himself and huts for the cattle, when it came to the people leaving Egypt, there weren't separate domiciles for people and cattle. Rather, Basukot Hoshavti. It was in Sukkot, shanties made for cattle, that we humans slept. Sukkot here is place, but it's place because of those shanties. That night, everybody, cows, sheep, people, everybody slept in those shanties. And that, according to Leviticus, is what we celebrate. God says, I made you sleep in Sukkot that first night. That's where I settled you.
That's where I settled you. Interesting. Okay. So let's get something out of the way before we even start. Like Talmud, right? We have a whole ton of baggage when we hear this word, um, especially if you come from a traditional Christian background. So let's again clarify our view here, how we view it. Okay. We've said before about a comparison between Zondervan's bookstore and the Talmud. They're the same. Both are repositories of multiple teachers with multiple views about a myriad of things. Okay. Both have important teachings and thoughts that should be discussed in open debate, uh, and not to condemn the other, but to share the other. Um, like we've been talking about here lately, various facets of Scripture, uh, and how they're recognized by others. Right. Um, Sadly, uh, all too often, not only do we not respect the other facets of another view, uh, but we rush to condemn theirs. The Talmud is a collection of many, many rabbis, teachers, and their comments, thoughts, observations, and studies on the Torah. Okay. Uh, it really has some fascinating sections to read about these rabbis that don't agree with each other, that both sides of the discussion is recorded for debate and posterity that continues on, right? We seem in our penchant to want to be right, to not even, we can't even publish a book where there are 4 or 3 or even 2 differing positions on scripture that and we can't find that in a single book. Um, as in they're listed, shown together. Take a look. So it seems, in my personal opinion, to be a sadly missed opportunity to have healthy debate and to allow others into the discussion, not to belittle their position, but just to share how one might view particular passages, especially in contrast to each other. Um, so let's not throw Talmud under the bus so quickly. You might miss something very special. But okay, so now we get to Sukkot. This is the third one in this example from what Rabbi Fohrman's talking about with these 3 feasts of God, right? So there's Pesach, Passover, right? Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Now, for context, let's set ourselves up. Let's draw a picture. We'll set the framing for our discussion. These 3 feasts, we've used the phrase, or we've heard the phrase, Jesus fulfilled these feasts. Like we talked about many times here on the Dusty Feet, I'm not really sure what that really even means. I don't. As in, was it ever said that after Messiah, then these feasts were no longer a part of life? As in, we no longer needed to remember? That thought process has continually bothered me. So now I tend to agree more with the phrase that Jesus is reflected in the feasts, as in, kind of like the Bible Project says, everything points to Jesus, Messiah. Okay. And, when I say that, it's not because they're the same, but they're different, but related. Yeshua and Jesus are names, right? First is Hebrew. The second is a development of post 400 AD split of the body of Messiah. And it eventually developed into the Latin, into our English rendering that we get today of Jesus. Okay. The Messiah is a title. It's a purpose. Messiah is what was foretold and was expected. It was the coming of Messiah and what that person would accomplish, expected or otherwise. So we just need to make sure that we keep those in for context. We're covering each for context, okay? So Pesach. This feast happens in the spring, first month of Nisan, 14th day. Traditional Christianity has used Easter to recognize this time. Yes, we know we use the term Passover, and we mix that when we've celebrated Easter. I know there's an origin to Easter, and it's not good, and that's part of our history. And mostly, traditionally, we just rather ignore it. We'll deal with that. Yet, in this biblical feast that continues today to bring to remembrance that path that brought us to Messiah. And then we remember the sacrifice of our Messiah each and every year. And at least for us here, that seems a bit more focused than Easter. We'll see. But okay, Shavuot. This feast happens after Pesach. It's funny, but this feast doesn't actually have a start on the day of the month of, right? In Leviticus, it mentions that it's right after the spring harvest. So the harvest has to finish first. This is when the first fruits are offered. That's another Yeshua connection. So in the original time frame context, remembering these feasts are for remembrance when the children of Israel are receiving these words, they're actually in the moment. This is the moment they're going to be reflecting back on when they get into the land and settled, right? They're in the moment when they're hearing these words, right? So this is the 50 days after first fruits. Again, another Yeshua connection with resurrection. This Feast of Weeks, right? 7 weeks plus 1, okay? So that's 7 Sabbaths and a day. So it's kind of a floater per se, meaning on the day when it starts, but we use Pesach, as the reference as to when some of these points start and how those days start. It's just the way it works in the calendar today. Now this Feast of Weeks, and of course Pentecost, right? That's the end of the 50 days. That time is where we have another fire-like interaction with God, where God begins another journey. You know, I'm not sure why we have a penchant for wanting to dismiss or erase the prior when starting something else, starting something new. I think it really is a weakness, since we lose our origins. We lose the associations that help us establish where we're from. This is what we've been talking about a bit last week about lineage, purpose, connection. And each year we have a feast dedicated to not only remembering the path that brought us, for instance, here to Pentecost, but it still continues each year to remind us to stop and reflect on that moment as well. So now we have Sukkot, 7th month, Tishri, 15th day. And this is in the fall, often end of September, beginning of October timeframe. Depends how it falls in the Jewish calendar. Of which, by the way, we are in year 5783. Just so you know. So we have another feast. So what are the Yeshua, the Jesus connections? Because everything points to him. So let's continue to test. So in that context, now we can delve into the connections that the video brought out and might have pointed to, and then we can reflect on them. Fair? So we have Passover, sacrifice of Messiah, reflected in the feast. Unleavened bread, burial of the Messiah. First fruits, resurrection of the Messiah. Pentecost, Shavuot, the coming of the promise of Messiah, right? The Ruach, the Holy Spirit. This is just a repetitive pattern of another burning bush, Mount Sinai-like experience, right? It's not new. It's part of a pattern of God's interactions with us, okay? We have the Feast of Trumpets. That reflects the second coming of Messiah. That hadn't happened yet. And of course, the Day of Atonement. That's a rather easy connection there with great white throne. Okay. So now we're here at Sukkot, where there's dwelling and provision. I love how wonderful and deep these feasts are. I really do. So I might start here by saying maybe we just might have to let go of something a bit. This will be a very challenging thought for many. I get it. As we see the connections to Jesus, Yeshua, because so far it seems we've had some rather strong red string connections to the Messiah for sure, right? We're all agreeing there. So now we have dwelling among us, dwelling together, provision. So we have in the previous feasts, all pointing to Yeshua, all pointing to Jesus, and all about his life and tasks as Messiah. But we've yet to encounter another beginning. Okay. Passover reflects his death. What might reflect his birth? Beginnings, dwelling, provision. Okay. So I want to stretch your thinking. It will for sure require some disconnections on a few levels, but walk with me and we'll see where these connections might be. So we have these temporary dwellings, these lowly dwellings that have a root in our collective past. So now maybe using the Ruach as a guide to bring to remembrance, do we have any other important times in life of Messiah that might have connections here? Okay. Okay, so here's that baggage check that I was referring to. Okay, I know that we, especially in Western culture, have traditionally marked the birth of Messiah during the month of December, and we like to call it Christmas. We will not be getting into the practices associated with other celebrations around that time of year in times yonder back. We're not going to go there. What I want to do is to bring us to a few points of interest and see if there's any red string connections that take us to this feast of God. So I think a few things in the video might have begun to pop out. And I want to bring up the beginning of the scroll from John. It's his gospel account of the life of Messiah. John 1:14, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Okay, so maybe let's put a few pins in our board on ideas with Yeshua in the middle, a la Sherlock Holmes. All of the feasts so far have, they seem, have either reflected the life of Messiah, hit my mic, or the role of Messiah in the future. So for his birth, for the sake of discussion, we have this Feast of Sukkot. Now, in the time of Yeshua's birth, this is the pilgrimage of the children of Israel to Jerusalem to honor the feast. We have Rome in control at that actual time. And they're using the pilgrimage as a good time to get a head count for the regional authorities, right? So Joseph is traveling south to Jerusalem with a 9-month pregnant wife. He doesn't want to leave her alone. Probably a longer story about why. Suffice to say that the impact of the pregnancy is most likely still an issue in that small village. It's only been 9 months. So Joseph reaches this tiny town outside of Jerusalem. You know, Jerusalem is packed with people. So they have to stop in Bethlehem, this little tiny shanty town. They reach the town, and the inns around have no available space. Visiting accommodations are full. Go figure. Yet the keeper of a local inn offers them a space in. And I'll be willing to be very flexible here and say in a temporary dwelling that might have multiple uses. But as the story unfolds, this temporary dwelling is used for a beginning. And we have the miracle of conception that got us there. The beginning of something new, and then the beginning. We continue to see the practice of repetitive patterns, right, of connections. And this one is tied very much, actually, to the rather humble beginnings of the children of Israel. A miracle to bring them forth, but a humble start to their journey. Remember that the Messiah will come from the lineage of these people, these chosen people. So now we have our Messiah, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled with us, lived with us at this humble beginning. And yet also a part akin to Talmud, and a cloud of glory came over us, and the glory of the only begotten of the Father, booths, glory, angels. The two connected parts of the event, dwelling with us, this future Messiah King. It's funny, but the protection of us is what is a Messiah and King. Interesting. So it might seem, I'll put up for debate and discussion, loads of coffee and donuts, that this feast is very much connected to and pointing to Messiah. And the season even described in the story of the beginning of the Messiah's life and the events surrounding it, and even more prophetic connections that those now looking from the outside in would find even more to connect. So this Feast of Booths, Sukkot, the humble beginning of something great. In the original story, the children of Israel on their journey with a humble beginning, and of the Messiah with his humble beginning to dwell with us, to meet us on one of his Father's days of remembrance, to continue to remind us each year as we cycle through the feast days to remember special things, some particular to the feasts, and some to continue to point to and remind us of the Messiah in God's plan. His part in the complicity of the will of the Father, too, as Yeshua did constantly, pointed us to and reminded us of the Father's, the faithfulness of the Father, the promises of the Father, the love of the Father. So now you have my giving an account of what I believe and why I now choose to recognize the birth of the Messiah on this feast, Sukkot. And I leave on a pondering note, not the point to ponder, we'll get there, but something to think about as well. Because we love patterns and connections. And our Messiah has a connection to miraculous provision and Egypt as well, right? But this time, it's a flipped pattern. Messiah is given provision, and I'd say miraculous, right? From men sent many, many months before, and traveled to the land to acknowledge him in the land. But those in the land of foreign origin tried to kill him. God protected him. Messiah flees to Egypt for protection. And he's cared for probably by the Jewish community in Alexandria. This is until God tells Joseph it's time to return to the land, and he was going back to Nazareth. More prophecy. And another humble beginning What good can come from Nazareth? Yes, that's in John. This is about our Messiah. It's a flip script filled with more prophecy. I love pondering. Now we get to our point to ponder. And I'll take this as a humbling rebuke at times because it keeps me in check as it should. If I know all the pagan origins of all modern day practices and have unraveled all the intricacies of all the conspiracy theories and have mastered all the pronunciation of all Hebrew consonants and vowels, but have not love, I am nothing. That is humbling. And thank you for being with us tonight on the Dusty Feet.